Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old Fourth Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
And I appreciate you making the appointment, however you do so, whether it's 9 to 10 or 5 to 6 p.m. weekdays on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, or when it's available to you on demand all day at ProgressiveVoices.com, or whenever you slide into your podcast. Appreciate you sliding on in. So the Dr. Phil Donald Trump interview aired. And what is it about two reality TV stars showing up to have a conversation that is unreal, completely unreal? Dr. Phil, a TV, air quote, psychologist, and Donald Trump, of course, of The Apprentice fame, who also played a role on the television show of a successful business tycoon. When that show aired, he actually wasn't. He had been pretty much left in the dustbin of 80s era relics, having bankrupted 4 companies, a grand total of 6 times, and pretty much faltering financially on his own before NBC and Mark Burnett Productions swooped in with tens of millions of dollars for him to act out the role of a successful business tycoon, to say the famous words, "You're fired." And oh, by the way, there are new and fresh allegations about the sort of language he used and the tone and tenor he gave to African-American contestants on that show versus their white counterparts. There's no point in even rehashing that until we get audio. And of course, because everybody signed lengthy non-disclosure and expensive non-disclosure agreements, it's just not even worth mentioning. I think by now we know the content of the character of Donald John Trump. And you're not going to convince his ardent supporters, and you're not going to convince his detractors as well to budge one way or the other without the smoking gun. And honestly, Donald Trump told us, even with the smoking gun, he could kill a man in broad daylight and not lose support. And he's a convicted felon, and he hasn't lost support amongst his core base, right? So here we are. Anyway, Donald Trump appearing on Dr. Phil's show, which aired yesterday, I do believe. We have some excerpts of that. And let's start with fallacy number 1 right off the bat.
I called for the other day, and I don't know if you saw it, but on Merritt Street Media, where I now do my show, I called for President Biden to stop all of this now. And of course, a lot of people said, oh, he can't stop it. It's a state case. Well, okay, that's an explanation for stupid people. But for people that understand how this works behind the scenes and all, I say the same thing. They need to stop this. They need to stop pursuing you. Since you started your campaign in 2015 to run for office, there have been so many attempts to get you off the board even before you started your campaign. Then once you were in office, 2 impeachment opportunities, they changed the rules to try to make it high crimes and misdemeanors if there were business conflicts, and in this case,
never ends.
It seems to be never ending, and that is a distraction to you. And I really wonder how that affects you. What do you say to yourself about that? Because it seems to never be ending.
It's a never-ending thing. There's a term that I know you've heard many times. It's called Trump derangement syndrome, and nobody's ever seen anything like it. In one way, we drive them totally crazy because we're doing the right thing.
Before we go much further, Trump starts going into the border crisis, blah, 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 blah. Abby Phillips had the opportunity to interview Dr. Phil after his interview with Donald Trump aired and called out Dr. Phil for using the term stupid people, and actually, he's the stupid people.
Before you go, in the interview, there was a moment at which you said the argument that President Biden can't stop the Trump prosecution in Georgia because it's a state case, you called that an explanation for stupid people. But it is also true that the President of the United States cannot interfere with a state prosecution. That's not how the legal system works. Why is that a position that you're repeating, even though it's very clear that that's not the case?
That is not the case in terms of strict law, but I think if anybody believes that parties on either side can't get together and get something done if they want it done, I think is very naive. That's
But
not
that's
the way
exactly
things
the
work.
kind of coordination that frankly, Dr. Phil, there is no evidence of. But you're also saying if that coordination happened, for example, in the hush money case, you would have called that a scandal. So why would President Biden do that in Georgia? Interfere with a state case that he has nothing to do with?
I didn't say that about Georgia. Actually, I said that about the case in New York. So you're wrong about that.
My apologies. But in the case in New York specifically, I mean, if Biden weighed in to make that prosecution happen, you would consider that a scandal. If he weighed in to make it not happen, why would that not be a scandal?
Yeah, doctor.
I'm not saying it wouldn't be a scandal, but I'm saying if you really think that party politics don't cross state lines, federal versus state lines, that there aren't meetings and people talk about this and make decisions about what's best for the party, and sometimes that's probably works to the good of the people. Sometimes maybe it doesn't. But if you think that there aren't politics that goes into some of these decisions, I think that would be a naive position.
Well, look, all I'm saying is that there's no evidence that that happened one way or
I'm not
another.
saying
Well, we agree on that point.
I just love this sigh. The educated, smart black woman sighing at the stupidity of a doctor, white guy, on her show for a stupid answer after he used the term stupid people to describe, I guess, a naivete on the part of we, the American people, for thinking, well, if you don't think that the Biden White House didn't have something to do with the New York case coming against Donald Trump, well, you're just naive. That's a thought for stupid people. I mean, y'all, right now, because of the Department of Justice headed by Merrick Garland, put in place by Joseph Robinette Biden, President of the United States, we have a trial going on with Joe Biden's son, Hunter, facing federal gun charges. He has every dirty deed done by his son paraded out for a court to adjudicate on right now. Ask yourself, would that be happening to one of Trump's children if he were in the Oval Office right now? I'll pick up right where we left off on the Dr. Phil Donald Trump conversation.
You wonder, why would somebody want to have open borders where people are coming in from jails, prisons, where they're coming in from mental institutions, and as you know better than anyone else, they're coming in, they're releasing the people all over the world, not just South America, from mental institutions and jails and prisons, and they're terrorists coming in by the thousands. They're pouring into our country. And who would allow this?
I'll tell you who would allow this. Donald John Trump allowed it, actually by a greater percentage than Joe Biden did. Now, sheer numbers obviously fluctuate because global events fluctuate. I mean, Donald Trump presided over a pandemic, for example, so you're going to have suppressed numbers during the pandemic. But as a percentage of those waved in, allowed in, versus held off or pushed back or sent back, actually, the numbers bear out that Joe Biden has actually been tougher at the border per capita than Donald Trump. I'll share that in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. I am not making that up. And by the way, we'll get around to Joe Biden's executive action this week when it comes to asylum seekers. I happen to think that this is, well, first of all, it's going to tick off a lot of activists on the left. But if you'll hear me out, I actually think that this is an end around to show that the Trump policies are illegal and will be struck down by courts. I literally think Joe Biden is putting that into play to show everyone, left, right, center, that Trump's ideas are illegal and will be struck down in courts by saying, all right, fine, we're going to try this. Watch. I'm going to show you what's going to happen. Bam, gets smacked down. Anyway, there's a table that I'll share that shows a 24-month period under President Trump from fiscal year 2019 to fiscal year 2020. That is, of course, his last 2 years in office. President Biden's first 2 years, in fact, 26 months in office. We have the share of those who crossed the border under Donald Trump that were expelled, sent back. 47.4%. Under President Biden, in the 26-month period after, so we're going from 24 months of Donald Trump to 26 months of Joe Biden, we went from 47.4% sent back, repatriated, to 50.9% from Joe Biden. That's turned around, sent back. 47.4% under Donald Trump, 50.9% for Joe Biden. The ones released, just let into the country, under Donald Trump in that 24-month period, 52.2% allowed into the country, 48.6% under Joe Biden. So we're seeing not only a nearly 3.5 percentage point swing of those turned around from Trump to Biden, but we're also seeing a nearly 3.5 point swing of those sent back. Joe Biden, per capita, tougher at the border than Donald Trump. And understand, conservative eavesdroppers, I don't say that with glee. I believe we have a responsibility as the leading economy and nation in the Western Hemisphere, in North America, to doing more for our neighbor. Not just because we are the most successful, blah, blah, blah. No, but because we've also done a ton of meddling in Central and South America in the last century and a half, militarily speaking, and we throw economic sanctions at struggling countries because we don't like the way they govern. We don't care for the S word or the C word. So sanctions. I mean, we bear a large responsibility for the economic and criminal and even environmental instabilities throughout Central and South America, and so we probably should be doing more. And I've spoken about this before. There's actually a multi-pronged effort by the Biden administration. I believe they launched this in February of 2021 to deal with the root causation of migration from these countries to try and restabilize unstabilized areas of Central and South America so that folks don't feel the need to flee and seek shelter, safe haven, asylum in other countries. Okay, so we have a lot more to get into from the Dr. Phil sit-down interview. By the way, he started the thing, you know how he does the promo at the start of the show every day? Unfiltered. This actually wasn't unfiltered. There's an article in The Independent and a lot of savvy eyes and ears, and you can hear it too in the audio that I share. There's edited clips. There's a lot of, we had to splice it down for time. That's not unfiltered. That's very much filtered. Anyway, we'll discuss more of the Trump Dr. Phil sit-down when the Ron Show returns. In today's show notes at ronshowatl.com, I will share the article from the UK Independent, Tom Watling reporting. An interview with Donald Trump from TV therapist Dr. Phil appeared to contain abrupt cuts, with social media accounts connected to the presidential campaign of Joe Biden suggesting the edits had been made to cover up for the Republicans' gaffes and confusion. Now listen, I feel like those of us who are watching this all unfold need to look at each other, both sides, and go, no, really? I don't think either one of you have room to talk here. No, seriously, I'm being honest. The hand we're dealt, so maybe this isn't something you want to start accusing the other side of doing. That being said, Dr. Phil started that segment, that entire show, with this promo clip at the very beginning that talked about how this interview is going to be an unfiltered sit-down, and yet clearly it was filtered. Anyway, that's just a little quibble point that I wanted to point out, and I'll share the article in the show notes at ronshowatl.com so you can glean some of the savvy, eagle-eyed, eagle-eared type folks who were pointing out, no, clearly this was not unfiltered. It was very much edited. Even with the edits, there's plenty more to dive into, so let's...
But in the meantime, we're beating them. You know, you mentioned I got impeached twice, and I won twice very easily, very quickly. We had great support from the Republican Party.
That just means you have sycophants surrounding you, former president, convicted felon Donald Trump. Why are you bragging about that? That's actually more an indictment on the party that you are, again, the leading candidate for president for.
I have all these cases all my life. I didn't have any problem. And all of a sudden, within a matter of months, I end up with 4 cases. Now, of course, it's from the White House and the Department of Justice.
Donald Trump had been in the courtroom a lot. There, I mean, how is he going? And Dr. Phil just sits here and lets the man lie. This guy is a doctor, a psychologist, and he's letting the man he's interviewing lie to his face. I'm going to read straight off his Wikipedia page. From the 1970s until he was elected president in 2016, Donald Trump and his businesses were involved in over 4,000 legal cases in United States federal and state courts, including battles with casino patrons, million-dollar real estate lawsuits, personal defamation lawsuits, and over 100 business tax disputes.
They totally control the state case. In fact, I'm not allowed to even be talking about certain aspects of it because I have a gag order. Think of it. I'm the Republican nominee. I was the president, and I'm leading the current Democrat by a lot. And I have a gag order from a local judge that was appointed by the Democrat Party. A local judge. He's a local person. And he is appointed, and he put a gag order in me. Nobody's ever seen anything like it.
While you're campaigning.
Well, why do you think he's campaigning, Dr. Phil? Can you not put that together? Come on, dude. You're a doctor.
Well, I'm campaigning, like you just mentioned a question that I'm not allowed to talk about.
Right.
Can you imagine? I'm the Republican nominee, and I'm not allowed to talk because a local judge from New York, appointed by Democrats, said I can't talk about it. It's so unfair. And then he gives a jury charge. Nobody's ever heard of a charge like this. He gave instructions to the jury. And by the way, the jury happened to be in a location that was almost no Republicans. You understand that?
Yeah, it's 87-13 in the last two elections.
Well, let's also again point out what I said yesterday, that when you looked at the jurors' news sources, even despite that wild swing in by the way, why are we looking at the way districts vote when we're deciding if a jury is going to be fair or unfair? All you need is one, right? If Donald Trump, 87-13, that sounds to me like he had a 13% chance of getting one, maybe two of those jurors to see things his way. And a hung jury means no conviction. Here are the news sources cited by 12 of the jurors. Well, not 12 of the jurors, but amongst the 12 jurors. Truth Social. We had one juror on that panel whose sole news source, the only one he chose, and they got to choose multiple, Truth Social. Who owns Truth Social? The New York Post, Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, the Twitter X platform. Somebody literally said that they get their news from the Twitter X platform. That's it. New York Post, Fox News, Wall Street Journal, all right-leaning news media entities. But talk to me about how unfair getting a jury impaneled of 12 in an area of the country that voted 87-13 against Donald Trump. By the way, an area that he allegedly thrived in for so long. I mean, you think that they would love Donald Trump because he had such a positive impact on the skyline there in New York City, right? And he can't get a jury of 12, at least one person on that jury to see things his way? Maybe it's an ironclad case. Just saying.
Republican, and I know you can't talk about it. I'm not under a gag order. I do know that the number 3 person in the Department of Justice took a pay cut and went down in stature to go to a state job and become one of the lead prosecutors in this case. But yet they say, hey, Dr. Phil, why are you saying that President Biden needs to stop all of this? It's a state case. That's exactly why I'm saying it. Don't be naive, people. Understand that there's a power play going on here.
It's controlled by the White House and the DOJ, 100%.
You know, Gerard Baker wrote in Wall Street Journal today, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, what do we say to those people that are rejoicing over reducing law to the status of a weapon in the hands of the dominant political power? Because that's what's happening right now. It's become a weapon. And that's not what it's intended for. That's not what we need to be doing. I mean, let's let the people decide these, right?
We did. We let a jury of 12 decide this, and it's going to go before an appellate court that, I don't know if anybody's seen the makeup of the New York appellate court, but it doesn't look good for Donald Trump. And by the way, that's not something he can take to the U.S. Supreme Court because, again, it's a state case. So when the appellate court affirms that decision by the jury of 12, again, one of whom cites his entire news sorcery being from Truth Social, and 4 others chose the New York Post, Fox News, Wall Street Journal, and the Twitter X platform. When that jury of 12 gets their adjudication confirmed by that appellate court in New York, and it's all said and done, then what?
They've weaponized to a level. They are trying to affect the election by demeaning, hurting in any form. And by the way, I think after the election, the hatred's great enough that they'll go, but with much less enthusiasm. This is about November 5th, which I think is going to be the most important day in the history of our country.
Okay, first of all, the arrogance to think that the election day he is on the ballot is the most important in American history is comedic. I would argue maybe the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or maybe the end of the Revolutionary War, or the end of the Civil War could rank a little ahead, just thinking out loud here. We also have to talk about this whole whining about the weaponization of the justice system. This is the president who had then Attorney General Jeff Sessions informing Congress that he was going to consider appointing a second special counsel to investigate Hillary Clinton's role in the approving the sale of uranium to a Russian state company. And of course, in 2018, after another round of tweets from POTUS back then, the Daily Beast had reported that the Justice Department had agreed to take a fresh look at Clinton's use of a private email server. 2 years later, January 2020, the department ended the investigation, concluding nothing of consequence was found, but not for a lack of trying by Donald John Trump. Back after this.
Want to be on the show? Have a cause or campaign you'd like to speak up for? Email Ron at ronshowatl.com or call 404-919-2725. The Ron Show on America One Radio.
All right, so today's show, we're taking a deep dive into the Dr. Phil footsie game with Donald Trump. That was just... not that I expected hard-hitting journalism from the likes of Dr. Phil, reality TV star, because I don't necessarily tune in to get hard-hitting psychology advice from the TV psychologist Dr. Phil either. But we're seeing this pattern, right, where we have celebrities, and listen, the left gets them too. I'm not going to sit here and quibble. I would say this, though. On the left, it's not as if we elevate our celebrities to a hierarchy that is of greater import. And by that I mean, we don't elect them, for one. I mean, with the notable exception of Al Franken, who obviously was a Saturday Night Live comedian, who, by the way, has a degree in political science from Harvard, just saying. Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, former actor, notably, right? Let's see, we've got the guy from The Real World. What was his name? The guy from The Real World who is now a congressman. Donald Trump, obviously, who was elected president after a long stint on a TV reality show, literally kind of capping his heralded fame because he wasn't a successful businessman by any mark at that point in time, and was able to parlay his reality TV fame to a rebound in fortune and obviously politically as well. And then we have to, and by the way, we got to talk to Oprah. Oprah, girl, what are you doing? First it was Dr. Oz, and now we have Dr. Phil, who says, by the way, he intends to interview, if he's entitled to, interview RFK Jr. and Joe Biden. We'll see about that. Nonetheless, let's get back to the softball interview. Donald Trump and Dr. Phil, who provided no pushback to the bevy of lies that Donald Trump spewed to his face.
Well, we're a country of laws, right? I mean, and that's what's made us so orderly. That's what's allowed us to progress forward. And
he says that, Dr. Phil says that just minutes after saying, well, the president could step in and stop this if he wanted to. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, because that's how things are done. Backroom deals, yada, yada, yada. If we're a nation of laws, then no, the president can't do that and shouldn't do that, Dr. Phil. Carry on, sir.
There's something that are called hornbook laws or black letter law that is just, these things are just been around so long. And these were violated in your case, one right after the other. For example, you don't let someone that has been charged in the same case as someone else, and they made a plea deal and said, okay, I'm guilty of doing this because they were intimidated into doing it. The lawyer in your case, we don't even need to speak his name, he bartered around out from under 65 years, looking at 65 years of imprisonment, down to 3 years and 2 years on this case and a tax case.
Who, by the way, was in prison for doing the work of the man you're talking to, Dr. Phil. But okay, leave that part out of the conversation, I guess.
So went from 65 years down to 5 years in exchange for giving them testimony against you.
That's how the justice system works. That's how law enforcement works. People take plea deals. That's what happens when there are bigger fish to get. That's what police and investigators and lawyers and prosecutors do. They offer plea deals to people who are doing. And by the way, we're so worried about Donald Trump going to prison for a victimless crime. Well, Michael Cohen went to prison for a victimless crime. But whatever. Continue on, Dr. Phil.
It's not supposed to come in, but it did. Pecker making a deal, a non-prosecution agreement. That's not supposed to come in, but it did.
I'm sorry. Again, let's point out that plea deals happen all the time in our justice system. Because this goes back to the whole sanctuary city argument that the right is they're just howling with indignation. Sanctuary cities exist because law enforcement needs them to exist. They need to have cooperation from people who are fearful of immigration, deportation. So they need to provide shelter, provide cover for anyone who might be there illegally, to know that if a cop comes to them and asks, hey, listen, we're looking for someone who murdered someone. Can you help us out? They need to know that, like, talking to the officer doesn't mean they're going to get deported, because actually, I mean, listen, don't get me wrong. Someone who's here illegally, they're breaking the law. But someone who murders someone, I think there's a priority there, right? That's plea deals happen all the time. Dr. Phil goes from telling us how naive we are to think that there isn't some sort of coordination from federal and state, but also we're a nation of laws, and what's up with all these plea deals? Come on, who's being naive now, dude?
That got into the jury box. They got to hear all of that. And so they say, well, if we're not down here for the reasons they're saying, then we need an alternative explanation, which they're not allowed to get, because your expert witness that was going to come in and say, as a former chairman of the Election Commission, was going to say this was looked at. There's no issues here. They didn't allow that person to talk. To testify. And I'm looking at this saying, how is the jury supposed to solve this problem if they don't have all the pieces to the puzzle?
Well, I know one piece of the puzzle that could have been offered, and that would have been the testimony of the man he's talking to in this softball interview. Why didn't he testify? Well, he offered that excuse earlier this week. You testify, and then they say something you say and use it against you. Yeah, that is how it works, sir. If you lie on the stand, you can be charged with perjury. And let's be honest, this man's not good at telling the truth, and perjury does come with prison time, potentially. And we can't send this poor guy to prison.
They wouldn't listen to him. They wouldn't talk to him. They didn't want to hear his testimony. They knew what he was going to say. He was going to say it was 100%. And very importantly, when they tell somebody, you're going to jail for 15 years, unless you say bad things about this guy named Trump, okay? Now, in all fairness, we know a lot of great people, but you don't know too many that would say, I'm not going to do what they want.
Yeah.
He goes up to somebody and they say, Dr. Phil, you're going to jail for 15 years unless you say bad things about Trump. And if you say the bad things, you're not going to jail at all. In fact, we're going to make you a hero.
You could also tell them, well, I'm not guilty. What are you sending me to jail for? Except Michael Cohen was guilty, again, for doing dirty deeds for Donald John Trump. So naturally, it's not just say mean things or say ugly things. It's corroborating, A, why you are in prison and who for, and B, that the guy on trial, who a jury of 12 found guilty after evidence, and not just Michael Cohen's testimony, but David Pecker's testimony, Stormy Daniels' testimony, and the lack of testimony from the defendant that he was guilty. Anyway, let me just continue on before I lose my train of thought here. All right, so we'll move along a little bit in the interview because they just keep badgering and berating the whole, plea deal situation, which is as old as our justice system in and of itself.
Did anyone ever approach you and try to get you to make a deal, drop out of the race, make a deal here, we'll leave you alone.
No, they didn't, but I believe they would. If I would have offered that up, I think they know me well enough. I really do. But, if I didn't run, as an example, I would have never had any of these lawsuits. How about I get prosecuted on a person that I have no idea who she is? I have no idea who she is. I have to pay $91 million. And that judge was just as bad, just as corrupt. A corrupt judge. I have to pay $91 million to a woman. I have no idea who she is. She wrote a book and she made a statement in the book. And you know that case. That case is a disaster. And then but I have no idea who she is. And they said I did things.
Actually, a lot of people testified that you did things that she corroborated. And oh, by the way, a photo of E. Jean Carroll put before the man and asked in a deposition, do you know who this woman is? And Donald Trump points to E. Jean Carroll and said, no, that's my wife. Okay, but you never met E. Jean Carroll. And E. Jean Carroll, by the way, wasn't his type, despite the fact that he points to a photo of E. Jean Carroll in a deposition and says, yeah, that's my ex-wife. Carry on, sir.
These people are corrupt and in some cases incompetent, but it's such an honor to have somebody like you see it and see it so clearly. And I knew that, I remember that years ago you were helping Oprah out, that she was sued and it was having a big impact on her.
Mad cow.
And I thought it was great. And Oprah used to really like me. She was here many times. Yeah. She loved my key lime pie. We have key lime pie, and she loved a lot of things about Mar-a-Lago. Yeah. And Roger King, as you know.
Yeah, we were here for the funeral for Roger King.
Correct, long time ago. It's the only funeral we've ever had at Mar-a-Lago. I said, maybe we can do a new business here. Yeah. We'll operate as a funeral parlor. But it was one of the most beautiful funerals in the ballroom behind us. And he was a great guy. And Oprah's terrific. But once I announced I was running and I said, we have to have strong borders, we have to have this, we have to have that, we've sort of lost contact, as the expression goes. But I remember when you were very much involved in helping Oprah. And that's really the first thing I thought when you called about this horrible witch hunt that, in all fairness, they've had going against me for years.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's been time and time again. And that was another black letter law that you just don't do. The judge tells you, okay, you can testify, but I'm going to allow them to ask you about this person that you now owe $91 million. I'm going to allow them to ask you about this other case. I'm going to allow them to ask you about 10 contempt citations that I've given you. I'm going to allow them to ask about all that stuff. What does any of that have to do with the matters at hand? And the answer is zero. That gets into the jury box if you take the witness stand. Again, that is black letter law. You can't let in unrelated things that have more prejudicial impact than probative nature.
So wait, let me get this right. You can't bring up to a jury a defendant's criminal past? They can't be reminded of that? Huh. Well, we're just going to have to throw out 250 years or so of judicial precedents in the United States for this one guy.
That just doesn't happen, but it happened 1, 2, 3 things right in a row, right. And that gets into the jury box.
If you testify, they'll be able to ask you about all these different things. And by the way, if you say one thing if you say it was a beautiful day, as I remember it, and it was raining out, we're going to indict you for perjury.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, I have a lot of lawyers that are friends and this and that. I had probably 25 guys over the course of a couple of months say, whatever you do, don't testify, because you'll say something that's a little bit off, and you will be indicted for lying, for perjury.
Apparently, he's got lawyers that do give him good advice. Yes, I can believe that there were attorneys who knew Donald Trump and reached out to him and said, bro, you get on the stand, you're going to say something that's not true. You're going to lie, and they're going to throw you in jail for it. Yes, I absolutely believe there are people in the legal profession who knew Donald Trump and reached out to him and said, yeah, you're prone to lying, and if you lie on the stand, it's not going to be good for you. I absolutely believe something Donald Trump said, I absolutely believe and agree with wholeheartedly.
These are evil people. These are sick, evil people.
Oh, I would have thrown myself in front of your car to keep you from testifying.
No, I know. I wanted to so badly. And by the way, I would have loved to have testified about those things because it was so corrupt and so horrible. But he wouldn't have allowed me to answer the questions properly.
For the life of me, I will never understand this. You're worried about being convicted if you don't testify, but you're also worried about being convicted if you do testify because you're afraid you're going to perjure yourself. At what point does your attorney or your team of attorneys step in and coach you? Trust me, this happens all the time in our judicial system, right? Lawyers coach their defendants, their clients, to go on the witness stand and to say and not to say what needs to be said or not said. Are you telling me that the man that we are supposed to assume is primed to ascend to the White House is incapable of being coached against him perjuring himself or can't go on the stand and defend himself properly without fear of perjury? But we want him to be elected President of the United States, leader of the free world? I've got some questions about that. Dr. Phil had no questions about that. Anyway, we will continue on with our deep dive into the Dr. Phil Donald Trump interview in just a couple here. The Ron Show continues on the American One Radio app, AmericanOneRadio.com, on demand at ProgressiveVoices.com, or wherever you podcast. We're in the home stretch of the Ron Show, and in this tough to listen to in the Dr. Phil Donald Trump soft pedaling. This is where the point in the interview where he goes to praise Eileen Cannon for, of course, not doing anything preferential or biased in Florida.
And it was really an unfair trial. There's a very brilliant judge in Florida that's holding the government, it looks like, she's looking into what happened, because, they raided Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah.
Right. And they took stuff out by the satchel. They took bags and bags of stuff. And I said, what are they taking? Are they saying what they're taking? Because they can add things. They can add the nuclear codes in there. They say, hey, he had the nuclear codes. And this was all stuff that under the Presidential Records Act I'm allowed to do. By the way, Biden was totally exonerated. Now, I'm not sure I want that kind of an exoneration. They basically said he's incompetent to stand trial, but he could be president.
This was just like minutes after he said that every attorney that he knows called him and said, don't testify because you're going to perjure yourself. Seriously, dude, some self-aware, whatever.
Think of that. He's not sharp enough, got no memory, got no this, got no that. He's incompetent.
Meanwhile, this guy was in Arizona yesterday doing a rally and welcomed those who were there visiting him as he was in the state of Texas.
Basically, they're saying he can't stand trial due to incompetence, but he can run for president. What's going on?
Yeah.
What are we missing here?
Yeah, it makes everybody uncomfortable about that state of affairs. And what I was concerned about with everything that happened in this New York trial is one of the big myths is that the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. Mm-hmm. That is the law. But I can tell you, after years and years and years of trial, the truth is that the jury sits there and says, I'm looking at all this, and if we're not down here for the reason they say we're down here, somebody needs to give me an alternative explanation of why we are down here. So if we're not down here because of what the prosecutors are telling us, then what's the alternative story? What's the alternative explanation? And when you get muzzled in the way that this judge muzzled this case, they're sitting there saying, what's the rest of the story? You're not allowed to testify because you're in jeopardy if you do.
Hang on. He was allowed to testify, Dr. Phil. He just didn't.
Let all of this other stuff in that should never get into the jury box. And so, the scales get tipped. And it gets very, very difficult to get even one juror because there's not an alternative story that if you could tell without being in peril, if you can tell without being intimidated, it would be a very different situation. The burden legally is on the prosecution, but logically with the jury,
until proven innocent.
That's exactly the truth.
Which is ironic coming from Donald Trump, who, by the way, was ready to give the Central Park Five, black men, are you listening? The death penalty back in the 1980s. Interesting pivot.
I can tell you that's the truth with me.
That's how it plays
happened.
out. And I did a focus group about this when I did a show on this on Merritt Street. And I had 250 people in, did a focus group, and I said, and overwhelmingly, the people were in your favor. But I found those that had questions, and I said, what is your question? They said, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yeah.
I didn't hear the other part of it.
I'm sitting here, and you've asked me indirectly a couple of questions. They're so simple to answer. I'd love to. Yeah. And yet, if I do, this guy's he's willing to throw you in jail, okay? This is an appointed judge, acting. He's an acting judge.
And by the way, who held Donald Trump in contempt 10 times. If he wanted to throw you in jail, Donald, he'd have thrown you in jail. He had 10 opportunities and 10 valid reasons to.
You do things for your country. And I view it, I think if my country weren't involved, because people say, the two questions, I get these questions from very tough guys like you, the biggest guys on Wall Street, people that you read about, but they're tough men and women. But I have the question asked often is number one question I get, how do you stand it? How do you do it? How do you get up in the morning and put your clothing on and go to work? I do get that because people don't envy it. And the other one I get is, will they do it again? Meaning, will they cheat? Will they do it again?
There again, Dr. Phil sits there with that beady-eyed look on his face, that bloated stare, and doesn't push back on 2020 election denialism lies. Again, on Abby Phillips, CNN, Abby Phillips had the opportunity to interview Dr. Phil, and I thought this was a more important question.
What do you sense is his inclination? Because just today, he said, for example, that he would indict the January 6th committee members, presumptively the members of Congress who were on that committee investigating what happened on January 6th. Are you more or less convinced after sitting down with him that he actually would follow through on those kinds of pledges?
Listen, Abby Phillips does a wonderful job, but I would have added, because we saw him do this in his first term, he just wasn't successful because there wasn't enough evidence.
Well, I actually don't think he will. I think this is a situation that, it's a process. This is something that I think he's had in his mind, that there's only one way to go, and that's to get even. And I think I really made some headway with him that is not the way to go. I think it's a process. I think he'll turn this over and over in his mind, and I don't think he will do that. And to the extent that I have any opportunity to lean into this with him, I am going to relentlessly try and get him to not do that.
Now that I'm almost done with today's show, I'm a little embarrassed and mad at myself that I'm giving credence to yet another TV reality star, air quotes, because this is what's embarrassing about our country. Honestly, this is what I think leaders like Vladimir Putin look at and go, "Well, this is their weakness." We want to be entertained. We want to be entertained by our politicians. We want our politicians to be entertainers instead of boring old governors. And I don't mean governors as in the state. I mean people who just govern. So now we have Dr. Phil, who's apparently now the campaign psychologist for the Donald Trump campaign. Great. I feel better now, don't you? All right, so I'll include the video of this and all the other show notes we have today at ronshowatl.com. Just seeing now jobs numbers came out. Another 272,000 jobs added in May. Unexpectedly high number. Wage growth outpacing inflation year over year. 4.1% wage growth, 3.4% inflation. That's a good number. Those are good numbers, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure your right-wing pundits out there and Fox News will try and spin this in some negative form. All right, that's a good way to put a cap on the day, on the week. I thank you for listening. Whether it's on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, we air 9 to 10 a.m. weekdays, 5 to 6 p.m. weekdays, the replay on demand all day at ProgressiveVoices.com. On the weekends, there is a Ron Show version at Progressive Voices on TuneIn. Download the TuneIn app and listen to Progressive Voices on the weekend, and you'll hear that familiar voice of yours truly. Show notes at ronshowatl.com. Have yourselves a great weekend. Hydrate. It's going to be hot. We'll catch you next Monday.